Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory. Ken is taking a well-earned break, and my guest today is an award-winning therapist, a fellow of the National Counselling Society, that's Professional Standards Authority regulated, of course. She sits on the NCS Professional Standards Committee, is a lobbyist who is a member of the All-Party Group on a Fit and Healthy Childhood, and has implemented outstanding therapeutic programmes to support vulnerable children, young people and their families across many primary schools, secondary schools, hospices, adoption and bereavement charities. She's here today to share with us the importance of training, specifically in child and adolescent therapy, and to tell us about the NCS Children and Young People's Therapists Accredited Register. It's my great pleasure to welcome Kate Day.
Hi, Rory.
So we've talked about, or we're going to talk about briefly, the NCS PSA YCPT Accredited Register, National Counselling Society, Professional Standards Authority, Young Children and Persons Therapy Accredited Register. That is quite a mouthful, isn't it?
It certainly is.
And it's an incentive by the NCS to help practitioners specialise in working with young people. What's it about?
Yes, well, the register is been put together to enable members to really highlight their skills and competencies in this work. The work that they're already doing with children and young people, but more importantly, a kind of Professional Standards Authority accredited CYPT register will add another level of assurance and protection to the public when looking for a therapist. Because my sense is that, I'm really keen and passionate the work of practitioners working with CYP is given more recognition, because in the 30 years of working with children, young people, I'm acutely aware of this fast developing need. And however, one of the major challenges, Rory, is getting governments to recognise counselling, particularly humanistic counselling, as a huge part of the mental health provision. So hopefully this register may help with this. Yes,
absolutely. And we will put a link into the show notes of the podcast. If you go to Counselling Tutor Podcast, our mother page, counsellingtutor.com, look for the NCS podcast, which will be the Child and Adolescent Therapy Register. You'll be able to click the link and find out more from the NCS. Now, I understand that, from our conversations that we've had previously before we made this recording, that you really are passionate about advocating for children and young people's mental health and well-being, Kate.
Yes, I certainly am. And I think it's been a passion for a long time. I guess it's become a way of life. I have always felt a strong moral responsibility to advocate for the rights of a child, to encourage a sense of what is just and fair. And I think what drives me is the struggles and the joys that I have seen. It's the stories of those children and young people I have been profoundly moved by that leave a kind of indelible memory, one that pushes me on and continues to live on in me. And it's these memories that kind of motivate me when I'm campaigning or talking to parliamentarians or writing governmental reports about child mental health, because over the many years of lobbying, I have noticed often a huge gap between what works in practice with a child in contrast to policy. I'm currently co-chairing a report looking at the current impact of child and adolescent mental health since the pandemic. It's to be launched in Westminster this September, but it's really clear in its message that there needs to be an urgent need for action. And I'm certain, along with all my other fellow colleagues that work on ground level with mental health, that we're not going to hold back from delivering the seriousness of this message.
Yes, and I think that anybody who's worked in child and mental health services will probably be cheering wildly at that kind of opening statement, because it is, from my sense, it is at epidemic proportions, the number of unwell young people that we have struggling with their mental well-being. And, you know, we need more than ever professionals to be able to be competent and to be able to help them. So with that being said, how do you think the register will help NCS members? How will that be helpful?
Well, I think it'll be helpful for members in terms of finally, as I said, recognising the skills that they have. And also, I think by giving people that access the NCS or access themselves, clients wanting to, it gives some sort of level of surety to the clients and maybe the families that are trying to access this support, that they have met the key competencies that we are required as part of our ethical framework for children and young people. You know, all people that register have to be familiar and trained in child and young people's practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that, you know, the NCS are running a Professional Standards Authority accredited register. This is something that is separate, and especially for those who practice with young children and adolescents.
Yes, absolutely. And I think also it differentiates the difference between working in adult practice and children, young people. And I have spent many years trying to pioneer the difference between the two and the importance of that.
Absolutely. Now, I think anybody listening just up to now will hear how passionate you are. You talked about your advocating and you're presenting in front of Parliament. What inspired you to specialise in working with children and young people?
Well, I think firstly, I just love working with this age group. You know, when I work with children, young people, it brings out the most hopeful part of me. I'm humbled by their struggle and joy to make sense of the world, and as they also try to make sense of themselves. You know, one of the driving principles of the all-party parliamentary group on a fit and healthy childhood I sit on is that childhood lasts a lifetime. And this kind of echoes my deepest intentions of my work with children and young people, because I have experienced, as many of your fellow listeners, the devastating impact of an unseen, unheard trauma or abusive childhood when working in adult practice. Often the wounding of the past may feel forever present. Sometimes when helping adult clients to tell these difficult and painful stories for the first time, I ask them to imagine driving past the house they lived in as a child, stopping, looking in through those windows, remembering themselves as a child and sharing with me what they see. I want them to know that I lay witness to the story and they are no longer alone. And in a sense, I am sitting beside them in this car, seeing and hearing the truth previously untold. If I can be that person for a child or young person at this very point, as these experiences are happening, the child can have a voice and I can do all I can to safeguard them from harm. Perhaps at the root of what inspires me to do this work is to reassure them it is never their fault, hoping to reduce any shame or lifelong self-blame.
Mm. Yes, I mean, very, very kind of inspirational words there, Kate. And it strikes me, and I've said this many, many times before to colleagues, that everybody's a stretched out child. Every adult you meet is a stretched out child. And I think it's easy to overlook that what a lack of intervention, the effects of a lack of intervention has at a childhood level. As someone grows up to be an adult, it can lead to things like drug addiction, self-harm, life-taking. The list is almost endless of devastation that can be left behind after a difficult and abused childhood. And, I think I don't know if you'd agree with me, but part of working with young children is try to offer a reparative environment so that children can heal themselves and grow up into healthy, fully functioning adults.
Absolutely. And, I think, that's part of why, sometimes people in the past have said to me, how can you work with, children that have experienced trauma and abuse? And I say, because I believe in their resilience. And, I see it time and time again. And I've been really privileged in my career to have worked with people 20 years ago that still keep contact with me, or still come back and return just to check in, or sometimes send me an email or a picture of their firstborn baby. And I see how life evolves despite sometimes really difficult, challenging environments that they have come from. And so I think we have to have hope in this work that they are resilient, and given that right support, and early, as you said, that early support is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're speaking about is the reparative element, a strong reparative element. And for those who are interested in that phrase, it's sometimes attributed to the work of Pachuska Clarkson, who talks about the reparative relationship, almost the reparenting aspects of being a therapist. Sometimes it's referred to as respectful reparenting. Now, there is a political aspect to your work, Kate, isn't there? And you've mentioned sitting on parliamentary committees. When did you actually get into lobbying? And for those of us who may not be too politically up to date, what is lobbying? So let's start with that. What is lobbying? What does one do to lobby?
Well, that's a really good question, because I probably still don't know. I kind of get told what to do, and then I just go along and I do it. I think in terms of lobbying, a lot of the time, what you're doing is you're taking. It can be a campaign of sorts, whether that's for corporations, or that is for charities, or for a goodwill gesture, but they're helping you basically as a kind of marketing tool, really, to get you into Parliament, to get your message across. And it's a lot about making, and I've been fortunate to be part of a lobbying company that are really pioneering child mental health. So I think that at the beginning, it's quite a funny really story actually, because it was 2013 at the time, and the level of suicide rates in young males were beginning to deeply concern me. And many of the counsellors I supervise were also witnessing an alarming increase in suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. I was also shocked by the lack of support available for even the most serious of cases. I clearly remember there being one CAMHS worker for a 50-mile radius covering over 20 schools. And I took my concerns to a local politician, and he ended up suggesting I took my concerns about suicide in young people to key parliamentarians. So after pinching myself, is this for real? I headed off to Westminster, and one nervous speech later, I just couldn't leave my concerns there. And the rest, they say, Rory, is history. I continue to be ardent in delivering this message. Suicide is the leading cause of death for children and young people in the UK. And at what point did this become an acceptable statistic in this country?
Yeah, I mean, that is just a horrifying statistic, isn't it? And you're absolutely right. A statistic like that, written on paper is a statistic, but this is about, end of life. And I guess when I think of lobbying, I sometimes think of it in terms of speaking truth to power, speaking truth to policymakers and saying, look, this is what's on the ground. And you talked about the CAMHS work at a child and mental health worker who was clearly overstretched in an area that needed so much support, and you came in and put this in front of those who can make decisions. Yes,
absolutely. And I have to say, I remember when I did that speech, you know, it did have an impact. And I remember parliamentarians, I suppose I was surprised that they knew nothing about this. It was like a kind of dark secret in our society. And I guess I suppose still feel a sense of sadness that here we are in 2022, and I'm still needing to keep delivering that message. There's so much more to do. We're still seeing, an increase in child and adolescent suicide attempts. So it's still something that really, really deeply concerns me, and I know other practitioners too.
And I guess this type of thing can only be addressed on a national level with a national strategy by policymakers, and those are, I guess, the policymakers are those are the people we vote for. We put our little bits of paper in the ballot box and put our X next to them, or some people just might write rude words and still post it. When we vote, we vote for people to listen to the people on the grassroots like yourself, speaking about what they're experiencing, speaking on behalf of those who can't, and then we hope that they will change the policy, and that usually comes down to money, doesn't it, at the end of the day? And yeah, that's what it comes down to, putting more money and employing more people, so there isn't just one CAMHS worker, there's a number of workers, to meet that need.
Absolutely. And when we consider the fact that, we want to be able to get to the place that, mental health in this country is considered as important as physical health. We're still spending, I think the overall NHS funding for child mental health is less than 1%. And whilst we see government still making promises in terms of putting new money into mental health projects, I can reassure you from being very much part of looking at this, it's a drop in the ocean into what is really needed.
Yeah. And I think you've answered that question quite eloquently. The fact that people need to speak to power and speak the truth to power and ask them what they're going to do, because we elect them. They are, after all, the hired help. We hire them to run our country, and we can de-hire them at the ballot box. I'll say no more than that, because I might get some letters in the post bag, Kate.
Well, I think I come from a very political family, so yeah, I will stay neutral on that one.
But we can hire them and we can fire them, and every election is the opportunity to do both. Now, we've gone through an extraordinary epoch of time in the world, but particularly in the UK, where we had the COVID pandemic. Arguably, the pandemic is still with us, but I'm thinking in the height of it, during the lockdowns, the school closures, 2019, 2020, part of 2021, what impact has the pandemic had on child and adolescent mental health?
Well, the impact of the COVID-19 on children and adolescent mental health has raised some serious concerns. Studies and practitioners are witnessing a decline in child and adolescent mental health due to the pandemic. We knew prior to the pandemic that it was already of a concern. But now COVID has intensified these risk factors for mental health. And the main thing, as you said, with COVID, it's disrupted support services in a huge way. So a lot of children and young people are now experiencing OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a generalized anxiety amongst many young people. And what we're seeing is often this is resulting in school phobia, a lot of children missing in education, haven't returned, from the pandemic. And that's deeply concerning from a point of view that, that not all children There are many children that might stay at home and be supported in home education really well, but there might be many other children that are vulnerable to not being in education. So it's brought on those sorts of factors. The lockdowns made it easier for perpetrators to target vulnerable children, young people online as they were alone in their rooms. And in particular, exploiting children as drug mules. And we're beginning to see a change in how county lines changed during the pandemic. There's also a concerning increase of eating disorders and self-harm even earlier in primary years. And the rates to referrals in the schools that I work with, the counselling referrals are at a record high. Those are at greatest risk are those children with mental health conditions, children with significant ACEs, or children with SEND. Support has been delayed during COVID, and often families are just left desperately, absolutely desperately awaiting diagnosis, assessment, and support. We're looking at the minimal amount of assessment for autism assessment in our area, up to 18 months to 2 years. And I think this has brought on a lot of other issues, not just for the child, but for the family themselves. And I think children, young people have had to internalize their fears during COVID, because it was a shock for all of us. Our world shut down overnight. And that was shocking for adults, let alone what it would be like in the minds of a child. And they now have to deal with a new healthy anxiety, on top of global disharmony and climate change. Their sense of their right to feel invincible, kind of this sense of believing youth will shield them from illness, is somehow been lost. And I think it's been lost because they've had to watch loved ones being fearful or becoming ill themselves. And I think this has left a sense of insecurity alongside the massive changes and transitions that young people have to go through already.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. We've gone through an existential crisis. Some may even argue that we're still in an existential crisis that's affected absolutely everybody. And one only had to look at the regular news reports to, sadly read about the deaths or illnesses or people seriously ill. And it was just relentless. And children watching that, I would imagine, of course they're going to pick up anxiety. It's all around them, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And, we live in a culture of 24 hours news feed, shocking news feed. I mean, many of our children are accessing things online or information online. I mean, as much, I worked with a young client that was traumatized by seeing a beheading.
Oh, gosh.
Live beheading. They have access to this type of material at young, and and when we think about that, we think of a child that's not developmentally or emotionally ready to see this information. Gone are the days. I was laughing with a group I was training the other day, that I always remember, the 9 o'clock news came on and you were all sent to bed.
Yes.
It was almost that we were screened to some extent from what was going on in the larger world.
Yes, and I guess that parents struggle to keep up with the technology and the platforms, and it's really, really difficult to keep children away from material that would damage their mental health. Now, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people listening to this podcast who are kind of roused into action, who think, gosh, this could be me. I want to be a child and mental health therapist. There may even be some people listening, a lot of people I suspect, who are maybe in their first trainings or have just qualified. You're passionate about counsellors who are working with children having key competencies. What drives that?
Well, I guess it started with an experience during my own adolescence. When I was 16, I experienced a traumatic and life-changing event. And at the time, there was little therapeutic help. And the kind of attitude back then was, it doesn't matter how much it hurts, just get on with it. Mm. And it was kind of clear to everyone around me I was struggling to do so. So help was sought. Unfortunately, this help turned out to be completely the opposite. And it took years to pick up the pieces from the damage of this therapy, and the trauma was left unresolved. In fact, it wasn't until I received a request in my 20s to give evidence in High Court regarding this doctor's abusive and negligent behaviour that I finally believed I was not to blame. And I guess other people's bravery and courage to speak up at the time helped me to validate my experience. And their voices are still with me today, ensuring I drive safe and ethical practice. Because as practitioners, we need to ensure we don't carry the wounds of our own past into the therapeutic relationship. Children and young people are so susceptible to our guidance. We need to remain transparent and conscious of our own archaic process. And I've taught on both child and adult advanced programs, but I've always been clear about this difference between working with children, young people, and adults. That is why I set up KRD training to specialise in CPD for children, young people. Whilst the core conditions remain the same, more active participation is usually required when you're working with children, young people than adult practice. You know, there was a lot of young people come to me and say, oh, I didn't like talking to the person before because they didn't say anything. And what we need to understand is that while sometimes silences can be appropriate, for some young people, that is excruciating. You know, that is excruciating. And that often comes from more of an adult-based model. And you find that you have to use your personality quite a lot, and sometimes support them with their understanding because they don't have the words or know how to feel, or sometimes don't know how to express it. So in my experience with children, young people, they often vote with their feet. You know, if they don't feel comfortable or they don't trust you, they have a strong sense of picking up when support does not feel genuine or they feel judged or unsafe. So I believe in authenticity. You know, this is a key skill when working with children and young people. Never hesitating to be yourself. Often you are required to have a lot of patience and offer a sense of playfulness, but yet remain calm and active. And when I train, I'm keen to offer sound base of theory, but also ensure creative interventions when you're working with children, young people, to enable them to express their feelings. It's important for people that want to work with children and young people to learn about the relationships around them, the family dynamics, as the child carries their family into the counselling room. I focus a lot on strengthening these relationships wherever possible, especially during adolescence, because it's a transitional stage to separate from family and parents. And this can be a really challenging time. And sometimes counsellors have to hold that space as they're developing their own sense of themselves. You know, how do they move from dependency of these familial voices of family to the internal voice of their own? And this can cause conflict. It's a confusing time, wanting independence and yet familiarity.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. As a former school counsellor who has a qualification in child and adolescent therapy, I have to say that, you know, with the best will in the world, you know, and a lot of people are passionate about being child therapists, you do need further training, because they are a different client group. And, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty pointed out, they have a different phenomenology. Children's lived experience is rather different to adults. And I guess this is part of the motivation for driving this NCS PSA accredited register, Kate.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a part of the driving is to work upon that kind of recognition, to really ensure safe and ethical practice with this particularly changeable and vulnerable age group.
I mean, that's really interesting. I wonder, can I ask you, do you have any concerns about the field of child and adolescent counselling as it stands?
I do, Rory, because concerns mainly for me is that the government only recognises a clinically, medically based modality and not a therapeutic one. And as we said earlier, it's so crucial, this recognition, for funding in terms of support for young people. So at the moment, the government is investing in training new child wellbeing practitioners, which follows a CBT model. And this is to work with low intensity clients and then for high intensity clients to be seen by CAMS. But we all know that the threshold to be seen by CAMS is extremely high. And this kind of leaves the middle ground, which includes young people with suicidal ideation who do not meet the CAMS threshold. And these young people are being supported all across the country by counsellors, either in schools, charities, or private practice. And yet the government still does not want to follow the other nations, such as Wales and Scotland, in making counselling provision a statutory requirement. So low cost and short-term fixes, often preferring a clinically based model, can threaten the role of counselling in schools. And whilst I appreciate that there's effective means in terms of CBT, I believe that children, young people should have choice about the therapy that they're accessing, as no one child or no one issue is the same. And in my experience, it is sometimes difficult to measure certain outcomes, especially when a child, young person has experienced complex trauma. I recall, Rory, working with a young person that had witnessed the traumatic death of an immediate family member. They were in the depths of grief and were suicidal for a long time. They wore the coat of the person they had lost every day for an entire year, throughout all of the seasons. And one day in the session, they just took it off. It was only then I knew they were willing to live. And there's no tick boxes to measure this unspoken yet enormous change. That is just one of the many imprints inscribed in my heart of the children and young people I work with. And I guess the greatest fear of mine is that we do not lose ever the core strengths of the therapeutic relationship, for it is the relationship that heals. It is the relationship that matters always in the end.
It's the relationship that heals and the relationship that matters. And I think on that note, on that very poignant note, Kate Day, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.